I've been reviewing audio gear for about 13 years now, and I've never seen anything like this. On the table here are 5 IEMs at around about $100, and they all have the exact same basic frequency response. It happens to be a fantastic tuning that's made IEMs like the Tangzu FUDU Verse very popular, but does that mean that these are all going to sound exactly the same? And if so, how do you choose which one to buy? I've measured each of these devices and listened to them extensively across a number of different genres, a number of different devices, to properly understand them, so I can tell you which IEM wears this tuning the best. Oh, and I'm also starting an IEM tier list, so make sure you watch this whole video to find out where I place each of these 5 on my IEM tier list. In alphabetical order by their name, we've got the Simgot EM6L, which comes in at $110, the Tangzu FUDU, which comes in at $89, ikko High Ear C, which is $79, making it the cheapest one here. The Kefine Klanar IEM comes in at $119 and coming from a brand new brand as their first ever IEM. And then finally we've got the Moondrop Starfield II, which comes in at $110. So let's dive in with the IEM that comes up first alphabetically in the Simgot EM6L and find out what it might have to offer. First up, I'd say that the EM6L here looks fantastic, it feels fantastic, the accessories are great, everything comes across here as being a bit more premium than what you might expect for the price. By the way, for this whole review, I'm not going to go into details about things like tips and cables and stuff like that, unless it's relevant. And so you can assume across the board that if I don't call anything out, it's because everything's satisfactory. If it's above average, I'll mention it. If it's below average, I'll mention that too. Speaking of below average, one thing that I do struggle with on the EM6L, and this will vary from person to person, is that I feel like the nozzle, it's a very thick nozzle at a particular angle that for me makes it a bit tricky. When I push this into my ear canals with various tips on, it starts to want to creep back out of the ear canal for some reason. I think it's purely that the nozzle is so thick that by the time I add a tip, it's actually too big for my ears. And so if you have relatively small ear canals, you may struggle with the EM6L. If you generally use medium to large tips or bigger, you should be completely fine. I generally use medium to small, sometimes small tips. And so do be aware of that if you're considering the EM6L. In terms of sound quality, one of the tracks I used for this test was Who's That by the Cat Empire, and the EM6L sounded wonderful. The bass from them is solid and punchy. The mids are a little bit forward in the upper registers, but generally pretty well balanced with everything else. And that means that they also bring a nice sense of clarity without any harshness, without any sense of fatigue. I do find that some of the high frequency sounds from these can get just a little bit unnatural sometimes. Things like the finger clicks in this track, for instance. It's not to the point that it becomes completely distracting, but I was aware that it wasn't completely natural. And so overall, I think the EM6L is excellent. One thing you can guarantee with the tunings across all of these, because they are so similar, they're all going to sound good. The question, as I said at the beginning, is which IEM is wearing this tuning better? Which one does it the best of all 5? And so far, we're off to a strong start with the EM6L. As I said, there is a little bit of unnaturality in the high frequencies. The upper mid-range is a little bit forward, but they're still very, very enjoyable. I should also mention that the staging on these is great. The width is particularly excellent. The layering and depth is quite good too. And that means we're also getting excellent imaging and separation of sounds. Again, we're talking about at the price. These aren't going to compete, and indeed none of these are going to compete with $300 or $400 IEMs, but for what you're paying, they're wonderfully enjoyable. And so the EM6L has set a pretty high bar. What we need to find out now is, do any of the others here in front of me beat that bar or at least match it? Let's continue on. Next up in the list is the fairly angular Tangzu FUDU. These come in at $89, meaning that they're $20 less than the Simgots. And what you get here is another nicely made IEM. I don't think it's quite as well finished as the Simgots, but still excellent. It is quite angular, so it doesn't feel quite as nice in the hand, but it's very comfortable in the ear, and I think it looks brilliant. I particularly like sort of the semi-translucent smoky back shell. And once again, like the Simgots, cable, tips are all fine. There's no issues with these at all. The fit for me is a bit better from the FUDU than it is from the EM6L. But of course, the big question comes down to, how do they sound? Do these wear the tuning better? The first thing I noticed when playing the FUDUs is that they're a little bit less refined. There's a little bit of a peak at 4 kHz, that could be the culprit, and it just makes these sound a little bit harsher, a little bit more fatiguing than you get from the EM6L. They bring a bit more bass punch than the Simgots, so take that into account if it's important to you. I wouldn't say they're overemphasizing the bass, but they have got that little bit more impact and a little bit more presence than what the Simgots do. I feel like the overall tonality of the FUDU is actually more balanced in general. And what I mean by that is it doesn't have things like the upper mid-range emphasis or the extra treble emphasis that throws the naturality off a little bit in the Simgots. And so I do find these more balanced from a tonality point of view, But because they do have a little bit of emphasis around the 4 kHz mark, I find them a little bit more fatiguing than something like the Simgots. One benefit of that tuning is that if you're into very sort of sharp, attacking guitars, these will give you a nice sense of that. So those of you that love rock and metal and you like to hear the crunch and the attack, the FUDUs could be brilliant. On the other hand, I don't think they do staging and layering quite as well as the Simgots. I think they fall just a little bit short there, and the overall presentation of these is one that's more about width and less about depth, and that also results in less sense of overall separation because there's not as much room to work in. And so for me, I'm going to give the win for now to the Simgot EM6L. It's a very, very close call, and therefore I'd say that if you're someone that definitely doesn't like any kind of upper mid-range emphasis, or if you want that extra bit of attack through things like guitars, then I think the FUDUs could be absolutely brilliant. Likewise, if you want a bit more bass punch. But for now, if I had to choose one of them, it would be the EM6L, but by a very small margin. And so it's on to our next contender, and now it's the cheapest contender, and that's the ikko Hi-EC. These come in at $79 US, making them $40 cheaper than the highest price competitor here. And immediately when you pick these up and look at them, they look and feel cheaper than any of the others. Not in a bad way, but they do remind me of some of the sub $50 IEMs that I've tried. Beyond that, there's no other issues, comfort is good, and indeed I should say the build quality is not an issue. It's just evident that they don't feel as well made as some of the others in this roundup. But beyond that, they fit well. The cable's okay, it's a little bit cheaper feeling and looking, but nothing wrong with it. The tip selection's fine as well. And so there's nothing to complain about beyond the fact that they don't feel quite as premium as the others here. Putting them up against the current winner here in the Simgot EM6L, and the Hi-EC has quite a different sound. Listening to Duncan by Paul Simon, and the very first thing I notice about the Hi-EC is its vocal is wonderfully separated, it's got a wonderful tonality to it, it's a really enjoyable IEM in that regard. One thing that also really stands out though is they're a much warmer tuning. These probably deviate the most from the general shape of all of these 5, and they deviate in terms of having extra bass. They do also have a 5 kHz peak in the treble, which could cause issues for some people. For me, it seems to be in a sweet spot where it doesn't bother me, and that makes them very enjoyable. And in fact, I actually found myself enjoying the Hi-EC more than the more expensive EM6L. There'll be many of you out there that go exactly in the opposite direction because you're going to prefer the more neutral and sort of balanced tonality of the EM6L. There's no doubt in my mind that the Hi-EC is a warmer tuning, but what they do really well is they don't get too thick. The sense of imaging and separation of sounds means that they still sound detailed, resolving, and clear, but they do it with warmth and with body. I feel like the soundstage from the Hi-EC is probably a little bit narrower than what you get from the EM6L, but it's not by too much, and because they've still got an excellent sense of depth and layering, you never feel like they're congested or closed in. Just richer and warmer, but still plenty detailed, plenty resolving. And so whilst I can absolutely see many of you preferring the EM6L for that more neutral, slightly upper mid-range forward tuning, for me it's definitely the Hi-EC that takes the win. I just can't go past their beautiful smooth mid-range delivery that's wonderfully separated and focused in the mix. That puts them over the edge for me, and I do love a slightly warmer tuning. And so for me, these are currently winning, but we've still got 2 to go through, so let's see how they compare. Before I get there though, just a quick reminder, if you're enjoying this content, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button too while you're at it if you don't mind. And if you want to see more videos like this one, make sure you ring the notification bell too. For now though, let's move on to the next alphabetical contender, and that's going to be the Kefine Klanar. The Klanar has an unusual name, I'm assuming it's referring to the fact that it's a planar magnetic driver. And these are the most expensive in this roundup, coming in at $119 and also coming from a brand new brand that you might not have heard of before. As I understand it, Kefine come from some of the brains behind brands like Sivga and Sendi, and they've proven themselves to be able to produce some beautiful headphones in the past, so I was curious to see how the IEMs would match up. The first thing to mention is that these look and feel fantastic. They're a very smooth, clean design, somewhat similar to the FUDUs that we talked about earlier, but a bit more refined in their shape, not as edgy, not as angular. The cable, tips, case, all of that is also fantastic, and that means we can jump straight into how they sound and whether or not they're better for me than the Hi-EC. As I mentioned before, there's $40 between these two because the Klanars are the most expensive in this roundup, the Hi-EC are the cheapest. And listening to Black Choice by Down to the Bone, one thing I noticed when I put the Klanars in was that I immediately missed the bass from the Hi-EC. On a track like this that's very funky, very rhythmic, it's obviously going to favour a bass-oriented IEM. And so straight away I was missing that. Having said that, the tonal balance and the technicalities of the Klanar are undeniable. And so I could tell that the Klanar had a lot to offer, And it was one of those cases where the track that I'd happened to land on just suited a different IEM better. So I decided to find something a bit more balanced, and I landed on Better Man by Paolo Nutini. On this track, I noticed that the Klanar is a bit less easy to listen to. The extra bass from the high ESC makes them smoother, makes them more relaxing, and does make them easier to listen to. On the other hand, the Klanar was able to draw out so much more clarity and texture in the sound. These were a bit of a step up in resolution, whereas I felt like the high ESC and the EM6L were kind of on par. The Klanars are a step forward. That also brings an even better sense of separation and image focus compared to the previous models. And in busier passages like at the 3-minute mark in Better Man, I noticed that the Klanar was able to keep things under control, whereas I noticed that the high ESC started to lose its ability to keep everything sounding refined and under control. I think ultimately the more balanced tonality and general technical prowess of the Klanar takes it ahead for me and definitely gives it the win over the high ESC. But the high ESC is one of those IEMs that would be a bit of a guilty pleasure for me. A little bit like the Meza Imperience as a headphone, where technically they might not be the very best out there, but for pure enjoyment because of their tonality, it's very hard to go past them. And so if you're like me in the sense that you enjoy a warmer, richer sound signature, then it is definitely worth checking out the high ESC. But if you're just looking for the best IEM from an overall technicality, tonal balance, just general performance point of view, I do think the Kefine Klanar steps out ahead here. And so at the moment, the Kefine Klanar is the one taking the lead, and I thought it was worth just quickly giving you a sense of how the Klanar compares to something like the EM6L. And the short answer is that the Klanar just comes across more natural. That little bit of emphasis in the upper mid-range and the treble from the EM6L just brings it a little bit undone when compared to something as well controlled, refined and balanced as the Kefine Klanar. So for me, for the $9 difference, it'd be the Kefine Klanar that I would buy every single time out of those two. The EM6L is still great, the Klanar's just better. And so currently with the Klanar in the lead, we've got one more IEM to look at, and that's the Moondrop Starfield II. The first thing I'm going to say about the Starfield II is I think they look and feel brilliant. I love this blue and gold design, the fact that the blue is carried through the cable, which by the way also feels really fantastic at the price. And these just feel like a really premium and special IEM despite only costing $110 US. Everything's not quite perfect with these though, because I think these could have the worst tuning system I've ever come across. And that's even considering the recently reviewed Simgot EA2000, where the plug sort of broke itself as you kept using it, or at least the strain relief, the plug itself was fine. But I think these go a step further into one of the most annoying tuning systems ever. You see, what they do is they provide a little port just below the nozzle on the earpiece, and then they provide these tiny little bits of black plastic that have to push into that hole. If you happen to enjoy them with no plastic in there, that's great. But if you want to start using the different tunings at different times, it is such a fiddle to take them out and put them back in that you're soon going to want to just give up and listen to whatever's in there. Now, if you can be bothered to play with the tunings, they do work quite well. They do have an impact on the sound. But after playing around with them, putting them in and out for the sake of measurements, I very quickly tired of it. And so I stuck with the tuning plug that's got the hole in it as my kind of standard go-to sound. And I tested this version of the Starfield II, which by the way was my favourite, so I did listen to them. I didn't just decide based on measurements. I listened, and I thought the one with the hole was my preference for the tuning. And so I put that up against the Kefine Klanar. So we're talking a $9 difference here in favour of the Starfields being just that little bit cheaper. And listening to Knock on Wood by David Bowie, the Starfield II sounded absolutely fabulous, despite this being not the best ever recording. The soundstage from the Starfields is fantastic. The saxophone on this track was way out on the left-hand side, well beyond my ear. The vocals were really well separated from everything else. And then there's also a guitar in the right channel, but the cool thing is it's not as far away as the sax in the left, so you get this really great sense of space and arrangement of the soundstage within the Starfields. And so I was really impressed with these so far, and was curious to see if they'd now taken the lead. Going back over to the Klanar, and they put a bit more emphasis than the Starfields into the upper registers, so up in the treble mostly. When comparing the two, and very much depending on the track, I sometimes felt like the Klanar sounded a little bit less natural. On the other hand, where the Starfields place emphasis in the 3 to 5 kHz range, that brings a wonderful sense of clarity, but could also get fatiguing for some people and on some systems. And so at this point, it was an absolute tie for me. I was having a really hard time separating these two, so I decided to find a tiebreaker track to see if I could split them, and the track I landed on was Every Day is a Winding Road by Sheryl Crow. In the opening of this track, the Starfield IIs did an amazing job of separating the guitar and the percussion. Everything was beautifully laid out in space, wonderful imaging, wonderful separation. When the vocal came in, I felt like the Starfields were just a little bit over the top with the breathiness and the texture in the vocal. It was a little bit distracting, a little bit unnatural. When the bass line came in from the Starfield 2s, it was just gorgeous. And so it was immediately showing me that it was going to be another tough call. Moving over to the Klanar, and I don't feel like it separated the sounds quite as well as the Starfield did. But on the flip side of that, it was a more coherent overall presentation that was in some ways a bit more natural here. Definitely when the vocal kicked in, the Klanar had that sounding much more true to life. It didn't emphasise some of the texture and the breath that I feel like the Starfield 2 did a bit too much of. It was still there from the Klanar, it just wasn't pushed forward at me. On the other hand, when the bass line came in, it didn't have the same tactile presence and feel that the Starfield 2 did. It was still good, it was still solid, controlled, a little bit punchy, but it was smoother and less tactile, and I do love a tactile bass line. The bass line where you can kind of feel the bit of punch as the air actually moves inside your ear canal. And so as you might be sensing, it actually remains a tie between the Starfield 2 and the Kefine Klanar. And in fact, I think you need to split it on a couple of different factors for you to make a decision between the two. The first thing is, do you want, albeit really bad, do you want tunability in the IEM? Are you willing to fiddle with the plugs that go into the Starfield 2, and do you want that feature? And then the other question is, do you want something that's a bit more tonally natural across the board to start with, that being the Kefine Klanar? Or do you want something that focuses a little bit more on the technicalities and the texture and the breath and sounds like that, because that's where the Starfield 2 comes in. Now, I did mention before that the Klanar does have a little bit of emphasis up in the upper treble that can occasionally be a little bit unnatural, but it's kind of a track-to-track thing, whereas the Starfield 2's emphasis in the 3 to 5 kHz range is wonderful, but not entirely natural, and it's going to be there and influence every track you ever listen to. So both are wonderful, and what I would say is the Klanar is the more natural, kind of easy to listen to IEM. The Starfield 2 is the one that kind of flexes its technical muscles a bit, which can be really fun, but maybe not quite as relaxing to listen to. And so out of all 5 of these, it's clearly the Starfield 2 and the Klanar coming in first. The high ear C from ikko comes in a very close second because of its wonderful rich tuning that's not going to suit everybody. And then the EM6L and the FUDU are right there as well. All of these are brilliant. And so you might now be wondering how these sit in my tier list for IEMs. These are the first 5 IEMs to ever go in my tier list. And if you've never seen my headphone tier list, the way I look at it is purely from an enjoyment point of view. I don't care about price. I don't care about technicalities unless it gets in the way of enjoyment. It's all about which ones would I most want to listen to. And so an S tier for me means I could live with it as my only IEM or headphone forevermore and be completely happy. An A tier means it's very, very good, but I probably would want to reach for something else sometimes. B tier means it's pretty good, but with a flaw. C tier means it's getting a bit shaky. And then, of course, Nope tier means I don't even want to listen to it. And so the great news is that none of these fall below A tier. And I'm going to give the EM6L and also the FUDU an A tier ranking. The high ear C actually gets an S tier ranking because it's just so enjoyable. And this is a good example of where it's about enjoyment, not what is technically better or worse. Because the high ear C is up there in S tier, and so is the Starfield 2 and the Klanar, even though they're clearly technically better than the high ear C, I'd say they're all equally as enjoyable. So that's pretty exciting, I think. We've got 3 S tier IEMs here and 2 A tiers. You really can't go wrong with any of them. By the way, if you've listened to any of these IEMs and you think you'd rank them differently, let me know, let us all know down in the comments. But for now, let's wrap this one up. Hopefully it's been interesting and informative to you. If it has, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.